There's a version of me living somewhere else. Not somewhere physical exactly, but somewhere close enough that I can feel it when I close my eyes. A life built from all the moments I might have chosen differently. A different city, maybe. A different first word said in a difficult conversation. A slightly braver decision made at a point where I actually played it safe. I used to think this kind of thinking was a trap, a way of standing outside my own life, arms crossed, judging it against some fictional standard. But lately it feels different, less like grief for a road not taken, and more like a compass. When I picture that other version of myself, I'm not mourning him, I'm listening to him. Because here's what I've noticed. The parallel life I imagine isn't random. It has a shape. It knows what it wants in a way my daily life sometimes forgets to ask. And if I stay with the image long enough, it starts to look less like fantasy and more like a draft, an early sketch of a self I haven't built yet. There's nothing wrong with wanting something better for myself. I used to feel guilty saying that out loud, like wanting more was an insult to what I already have. But wanting isn't the same as rejecting. I can be grateful for this life and still feel a pull toward a fuller one. Those two things live in the same body without contradiction. What surprises me most in the quiet practice of noticing this is how much is already here, waiting. Not somewhere far off in that other timeline, but inside this one. Capabilities I haven't switched on yet. Instincts I've muted because they seemed inconvenient or because acting on them once felt too exposed. They didn't disappear. They're sitting in the dark, patient the way a muscle waits even after months of not being used. I think that's the real use of imagining a parallel self, not as an escape hatch, but as a kind of map. The differences between where I am and where that other version stands aren't proof of failure, they're directions, small, specific ones written in the language of longing instead of instruction. So lately, when I catch myself picturing that other life, I try to ask a quieter question underneath the daydream. What does he know that I haven't let myself know yet? What is he doing with his mornings, his attention that I keep postponing? The answers are rarely dramatic. Usually they're small and stubbornly practical. Say the honest thing sooner. Protect the mornings. Stop performing a certainty I don't feel. And maybe that's the actual bridge between the two lives. Not some cosmic shift in circumstance, but a willingness to let the emotions I usually push aside actually inform what I do next. The restlessness, the quiet dissatisfaction that shows up on ordinary afternoons, the flicker of envy toward a life that looks freer than mine. These aren't distractions from the truth. They might be messages from it. I don't know if that other universe is real anywhere outside my own mind. Maybe it doesn't need to be. Maybe its only job was always to sit here, just out of reach, reminding me that the distance between who I am and who I could be isn't fixed. It moves every time I choose to listen to what's underneath the wanting. There's a strange comfort in that. It means the work was never about teleporting into some better timeline, waiting for circumstances to rearrange themselves in my favor. It was about paying attention to the version of myself that already knows the way, even if he only shows up in flashes, in daydreams, in the quiet minute before sleep. He isn't ahead of me on some separate road. He's underneath me, waiting to be uncovered. So I'm learning to treat the parallel universe less like a place and more like a practice, a daily return to the feeling of what's possible, followed by one small, unglamorous action that moves me an inch closer to it. Not a leap, just a shift in direction, repeated until it becomes who I am instead of who I imagine. There's a difference between a finished thing and a first draft. And I think we forget that difference when it comes to picturing who we might become. We imagine some final version of ourselves, fully formed, already arrived, and then feel discouraged when we don't match it yet. But that's not how anything real gets built. Not a book, not a house, not a life. When I picture that other version of myself, the one living the fuller life, I used to treat him like a finished product, a target I either hit or missed. Lately, I've started treating him differently, as a draft, something sketched in pencil, meant to be revised, erased in places, redrawn as I learn more about what actually works. You know that feeling when you write something down and it's rough, but it's rough in the right direction? That's what this is. The parallel self isn't a finished blueprint handed down from somewhere else. He's assembled out of every small correction you make along the way, the sentence you rewrite, the habit you adjust, the reaction you catch yourself having and choose to respond to differently the second time. We tend to want the clean version of change. One decision, one turning point, and suddenly a new person emerges. But drafts don't work that way, and neither do people. A draft gets messier before it gets clearer. You cross things out, you write in the margins. You go back to page 1 after finishing page 10 because something you learn later changes how the beginning should read. I think that's actually good news. It means I don't have to arrive at the fuller version of myself in one move. I just have to keep revising. Today's draft doesn't need to be right. It just needs to be honest about where I actually am, so the next version has something true to work from. There's a kind of freedom in that. When you stop expecting the first version of anything to be the final one, you stop being so afraid of getting it wrong. Mistakes aren't failures in a draft, they're information. They tell you what to cut, what to keep, what to say more clearly next time. We spend so much energy trying to skip ahead to the polished ending, the clean story, the version we'd be proud to show someone else. But the parallel self, I imagine, isn't polished either. He's just furthered along in the same revision process I'm in right now. He made more passes, he crossed out more wrong turns. He's not smarter than me, he's just further into his own draft. So, today, instead of measuring the distance between who I am and who I imagine, I'm trying something smaller. One revision, one sentence rewritten, one reaction chosen a little more deliberately than the reaction before it. Not the whole book rewritten in a day, just the next page made slightly more honest than the last. Maybe that's what it actually means to become someone new. Not a single transformation, but thousands of small edits applied patiently until one day the draft reads like something you'd actually want to publish. Until the person on the page and the person living the life are finally, quietly the same. There's something else I've noticed about drafts. You can't edit a blank page. The rough version, the one full of clumsy sentences and half-formed ideas, is what gives you something to work with in the first place. So maybe the version of me that hasn't gotten it right yet isn't a problem to be fixed before real life can start. He's the necessary rough draft that makes the good version possible later. Without him, there's nothing to revise at all. We often treat our current selves as obstacles standing between us and who we want to be. But a draft isn't an obstacle to the finished piece, it's the only path to it. Every version of me I've been embarrassed by, every attempt that didn't quite land, was doing its job. It was getting something down so I'd have material to improve. So maybe the kindest thing I can do for the person I'm becoming is to stop apologizing for the draft I am right now. To let this version be rough, be unfinished, be full of crossed out lines, and trust that the revising itself is the process, not a delay of it.
My body usually knows things before I do. A tightness in the chest before I can name what's wrong. A pull toward the door before I've consciously decided I'm done with a conversation. A restlessness in the legs on a Sunday evening that has nothing to do with needing exercise and everything to do with a week I don't want to walk back into. We treat these signals like noise, static to be managed, when they might actually be the clearest information we get all day. I used to override most of it. Feel the discomfort, name it as inconvenient, push through anyway. Somewhere along the way, I learned that ignoring the body was a kind of discipline, that the mature thing to do was override the signal and keep moving. But you can only override a message so many times before you stop receiving it clearly at all. Lately, I've been trying something different. Instead of asking what I should logically do next, I ask what I already feel pulling me toward or away from something, and then I try to translate that feeling instead of dismissing it. Not obey it blindly, translate it. Envy, for example, isn't just an ugly emotion to suppress. It's often a very precise map pointing at something you actually want, but haven't let yourself admit. We treat the rational mind as the only trustworthy narrator of a life, and the body as something separate, animal, best kept quiet. But the body doesn't lie the way the mind sometimes does to protect itself. It doesn't rationalize. It doesn't perform confidence. It doesn't feel. When your stomach drops before a decision, that's not weakness. That's data arriving faster than language can process it. I think this is part of what it means to trust that other version of yourself, the fuller one, the one already living closer to what you actually want. He's not somewhere abstract. He shows up in the flinch, the hesitation, the sudden lightness you feel when an idea finally clicks into place. Those aren't distractions from figuring out your life. They're the earliest drafts of the answer. You've probably noticed this too. The decisions that felt wrong in your gut long before your mind caught up with reasons why. And the ones that felt right immediately, before you could fully justify them to anyone else. We spend so much time building arguments for choices our bodies already made minutes, days, sometimes years earlier. So now, when a feeling shows up that I don't immediately understand, I try to stay with it a little longer before explaining it away. Not analyzing it into submission, just sitting with it, the way you'd sit with a message you haven't finished reading yet. What is this restlessness actually about? What is this quiet dread trying to protect me from or point me toward? We're taught to think our way into a better life, plan it, structure it, reason it into existence, and there's a place for that. But some of the most honest information I have about who I'm becoming doesn't arrive as thought at all. It arrives as sensation first, translated into words only later if I'm patient enough to listen before I explain. There's a kind of humility in admitting that. It means the mind isn't always in charge, even when it insists it is. It means somewhere underneath the plans and the pros and cons lists, something older and quicker has already cast a vote. We just haven't always been taught to read the ballot. I think about how animals move through the world without needing to justify their instincts first. A dog doesn't build a case for why it wants to go outside. It simply knows and moves. Somewhere in growing up, we learn to distrust that kind of knowing in ourselves, to demand evidence before we let a feeling count as real information. Maybe part of becoming who I actually want to be is unlearning that distrust, at least a little. So the next time my chest tightens before I've said a word, or my shoulders drop with relief before I've consciously agreed to something, I want to notice it as a message instead of an inconvenience. Not the whole answer, just the first line of it, arriving early, waiting for the rest of me to catch up.
Nobody ever notices the safe choice being made. That's the strange thing about it. The risky decision announces itself, gets remembered, gets talked about at dinner years later. But the safe one slips by, quietly, disguised as good judgment, and you rarely clock it as a decision at all. You just call it being responsible. I've made hundreds of those choices without registering a single one as a fork in the road. The job I didn't leave, the conversation I softened until it lost its point, the idea I kept to myself because someone might have found it strange. Each one felt small in the moment, almost invisible, the kind of thing you forget by lunchtime. But add them up over a decade, and you get a shape. A life quietly built out of 1,000 tiny avoidances, none dramatic enough to regret on their own, all of them together, forming something that looks a lot like caution, mistaken for identity. You start to believe that's just who you are, careful, measured, sensible, without noticing how much of it was fear wearing a more respectable name. We like to imagine that regret arrives as one clear moment, a single door we should have walked through. It rarely works that way. More often, it arrives as a low hum underneath an otherwise fine life, nothing wrong exactly, just a persistent sense that somewhere you traded aliveness for stability and didn't notice the exchange rate at the time. You can tell yourself the safe choice was practical, and often it was. Bills exist, responsibilities exist. I'm not arguing for recklessness dressed up as courage. What I'm questioning is the automatic reflex, the way safety became the default answer to almost everything, applied without even weighing the alternative first. There's a version of this pattern I recognize in myself immediately. The idea that arrives fully formed, exciting, a little frightening, and the speed at which I talk myself out of it before anyone else even hears it. Not because I examined it and found it lacking, but because unfamiliar things trigger a kind of internal alarm that safety learned to sound faster than curiosity could respond. What would it cost, really, to let one of those ideas survive past the alarm? Not every idea, not recklessly, just the ones that keep returning, the ones that show up again a week later, still asking to be taken seriously. Maybe those deserve a different kind of scrutiny than instant dismissal, the scrutiny of actually being tried instead of just imagined and buried. I don't think the goal is to abandon safety altogether. It's to stop letting it make every decision by default, unexamined simply because it's familiar. Some choices deserve caution. Others deserve a real chance, even an uncomfortable one. Telling the difference might be one of the more important skills nobody teaches directly. You just have to keep practicing it, one small risk at a time, until the muscle remembers how to move again. There's a particular kind of tiredness that comes from a life spent avoiding things. It doesn't look like exhaustion from doing too much. It looks like a low-grade flatness, a sense that the days are technically fine, but strangely weightless, like you've been watching your own life from a few feet away instead of standing inside it. That flatness, I've come to think, is often the actual cost of the safe choice. Not disaster, just a slow draining of aliveness that's hard to point to directly. You notice it most in retrospect. Looking back at a year and struggling to name a single moment that felt genuinely uncertain, genuinely alive with possibility, every month resembled the last. Every choice was reasonable. And somehow that reasonableness, stacked high enough, starts to feel like its own quiet kind of loss. So maybe the question worth asking isn't whether a choice is safe or risky. It's whether the safety is actually protecting something worth protecting, or just protecting the feeling of not having to face uncertainty at all. Those are different things, even though they wear the same cautious expression. Learning to tell them apart, choice by choice, might be the real work. I got good at sounding sure of myself long before I actually was. It's a strange skill once you notice you have it. The ability to answer a question with a steady voice while some quieter part of you is still scrambling for the actual answer underneath. Nobody taught me this directly. I think I just learned somewhere early that hesitation reads as weakness, so I trained the hesitation to stay invisible. For a long time, that worked well enough. People trust confidence, even when it's borrowed. They rarely ask to see the receipts behind it. And so I kept performing certainty in meetings, in conversations, in decisions I hadn't fully made peace with because the performance got results the honesty might not have. But performing something long enough starts to cost you access to the real version underneath it. You forget which parts of your certainty are genuine and which parts are just well-rehearsed. The voice that says, "I've got this," becomes automatic, disconnected from whether you actually do, and eventually you can't always tell the difference yourself. You've probably felt this too. The exhaustion that comes not from doing hard things, but from constantly appearing unbothered while doing them. That specific tiredness isn't about the task at all. It's about the extra layer of labor spent managing how uncertain you're allowed to look while doing it. I started wondering what would happen if I dropped the performance in small doses. Not everywhere, not dramatically, just in the low-stakes moments where nothing much was riding on looking assured. Saying, "I'm not sure," out loud instead of manufacturing an answer on the spot. Admitting a decision felt shakier than my tone usually let on. What surprised me was how little happened. No one recoiled, nobody lost respect the way the old alarm insisted they would. If anything, people leaned in a little closer, as if the honesty itself was more interesting than the performance had ever been. Certainty, it turns out, isn't nearly as persuasive as we've been trained to think it is. There's something almost relieving about admitting you don't know. It removes the constant maintenance work of keeping the act airtight, checking it for cracks, rehearsing the next line before you've even finished the current one. Underneath all that maintenance was just a person, uncertain like everyone else, who'd convinced himself uncertainty needed to be hidden to be acceptable. We build these borrowed voices early, usually for good reason at the time. They protect something. But a voice built for protection isn't always the same voice that tells the truth, and somewhere along the line, I stopped noticing the gap between the two. Closing that gap doesn't mean abandoning confidence altogether. It means letting the confidence be real, even when real confidence sometimes sounds like admitting you're still figuring it out. I think about where I first learned the performance, and it usually traces back to a room where being unsure felt dangerous somehow. A classroom, a family dinner, an early job where the wrong hesitation got mistaken for incompetence. The lesson landed hard and stayed. Sound certain first. Sort out the truth of it later, in private, where no one could see the sorting happen. The trouble is that private sorting almost never happens. There's always another moment demanding the same performance, and the backlog of unresolved uncertainty just keeps growing quietly underneath the confident voice, unaddressed. You end up fluent in sounding sure and increasingly distant from what you actually believe. So lately, I've been practicing a smaller kind of bravery. Not the bravery of bold declarations, but the quieter kind. Saying, I don't know yet, and staying in the room afterward instead of rushing to fill the silence with false authority. It feels vulnerable every single time. It also feels, finally, like my own voice instead of a borrowed one.
Nobody films the boring part, the making the bed part, the answering emails part, the going to sleep at a decent hour part. We see the highlight reel of someone's transformation, the launch, the finished body of work, the moment they finally say the brave thing out loud, and we mistake that highlight for the actual mechanism. But the mechanism was never dramatic. It was just repetition, mostly unwitnessed. I used to wait for the big moment before I let myself believe change was happening. Some clear turning point I could point to later and say that's when everything shifted. But looking back honestly, I can't find one. What I find instead is a long line of forgettable Tuesdays. A slightly earlier bedtime, a conversation I had instead of avoided, a paragraph written before checking my phone instead of after. None of those moments felt significant while they were happening. They felt almost embarrassingly small, barely worth mentioning to anyone. And that's exactly why I think we underestimate them. Significance, we assume, should feel significant in the moment, but most of what actually rebuilds a life happens below the threshold of feeling important at all. You can tell the difference between someone chasing transformation and someone practicing it by what they're willing to do when no one's watching and nothing dramatic is on offer. The dramatic version wants applause built in. The quiet version just wants the next small thing done, whether or not it ever gets noticed, whether or not it ever becomes a story worth telling later. We're drawn to the idea of reinvention because it's efficient, one decision, one clean before and after. But real change rarely respects at shape. It accumulates sideways in increments too small to notice individually, the way a shoreline changes without any single wave seeming responsible for the difference. I think that's part of why change feels so hard to sustain when we chase it through big gestures alone. A single traumatic decision burns bright and fades fast because it was never built to be repeated daily. A small, unglamorous action, on the other hand, barely asks anything of you. It's easy enough to do again tomorrow and the day after, precisely because it never demanded a grand performance to begin with. So I've stopped waiting for the version of this that feels cinematic. Instead, I try to notice the smallest available next step and just take it, without needing it to mean anything larger than what it is. Write the one paragraph. Have the one honest conversation. Go to sleep 10 minutes earlier than last night. Nothing about it looks like transformation from the outside. But give it enough ordinary days stacked quietly on top of each other, and eventually you look up and realize the person doing all these small, unglamorous things has become someone noticeably different than the one who started. Not because of one leap, but because he kept choosing the next small thing, long after it stopped feeling exciting to choose. There's a version of this I notice in people who seem from the outside to simply have arrived somewhere impressive. A steady career, a calm presence, a life that looks assembled with intention. And almost every time when you actually ask them how they got there, the answer disappoints the part of you hoping for a secret. It's rarely a single insight. It's usually years of unremarkable choices made consistently, long enough that consistency itself became the impressive part. I think we avoid the small path partly because it doesn't offer a story we can tell right away. A leap makes for a good sentence. A decade of quiet mornings doesn't summarize easily, so we undervalue it, even while secretly suspecting it's the thing that actually works. There's no immediate reward for choosing the boring option today over the exciting one in the night, which is exactly why so few people keep choosing it long enough to see what it builds. So maybe the real skill isn't finding the courage for one big moment. It's finding enough patience for 1,000 small ones, none of which will ever make it into the highlight reel, all of which are quietly doing the actual work underneath it.
Envy used to embarrass me before I understood what it was actually saying. The flicker of it when a friend announced something good. The tightness in my jaw when someone else's life looked freer than mine. I treated all of it as evidence of some character flaw I needed to hide, or better yet, eliminate. As if a good person simply wouldn't feel this way in the first place. So I got skilled at judging the feeling the moment it appeared. Catch the envy, condemn it, bury it under a quick reminder to be grateful instead. The whole process took seconds, fast enough that I rarely had to actually sit with what the envy was pointing toward. I was too busy disciplining myself for having felt it at all. It took a while to notice the judgment was doing more harm than the original feeling ever could. Every time I punished myself for envy, I lost the chance to ask what it knew, because underneath almost every jealous flicker is a very specific piece of information. Not that you're a bad person, but that you want something you haven't let yourself name directly yet. We treat emotions like restlessness or envy as problems requiring immediate correction, when they might be better understood as messengers arriving with news. The message isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it says you're bored in a life that looks fine on paper. Sometimes it says you're avoiding a decision you already know the answer to. But you can't read a message you're too busy shooting down to actually open. Listening without judging doesn't mean approving of everything you feel. It means giving the feeling enough room to finish its sentence before you decide what to do about it. Restlessness on a Sunday afternoon isn't a character defect. It's information about a week, a routine, maybe a whole season of choices that no longer fit. Shutting it down fast doesn't make the misfit disappear. It just makes it harder to locate later. I've started practicing a small pause whenever one of these uncomfortable feelings shows up. Instead of immediately labeling it as good or bad, useful or shameful, I try to just notice it plainly. There's envy here. There's restlessness here. No verdict attached yet, just an acknowledgement that something is present and probably has a reason for being. What's changed since I started doing this is subtle but real. The feelings themselves seem to soften once they're not being fought. It's almost as if they only needed acknowledgement in the first place, not elimination. Once they've been heard, they stop insisting so loudly, and underneath the noise, there's usually a much quieter, clearer piece of guidance waiting. I don't think this makes envy or restlessness pleasant to feel. It just makes them useful instead of shameful, which turns out to be a meaningful difference. Every uncomfortable feeling I've stopped judging long enough to actually listen to has told me something true about a direction I was already quietly wanting to go. There's a particular kind of relief in dropping the self-criticism part of this practice. For years, I assumed the judgment was necessary, that without it, I'd become someone who acted on every fleeting emotion without discernment. But listening isn't the same as obeying. You can hear a feeling out completely and still choose not to act on it right away.
The judgment was never actually protecting me from bad decisions. It was just adding an extra layer of shame on top of information I needed anyway. You start to notice how much energy the judging used to take. Every emotion arriving immediately followed by a second wave of commentary about whether you should be feeling it, whether it says something bad about you, whether a better person would have skipped this reaction entirely. Removing that second wave doesn't just make the emotions easier to understand, it makes the whole day feel lighter, like putting down a weight you didn't realize you'd been carrying. So now, when restlessness or envy shows up uninvited, I try to greet it the way you'd greet an old acquaintance with something to say. Not thrilled to see them necessarily, but willing to listen because they usually have a point buried somewhere in there worth hearing before they go.
For most of my life, I assumed there was a finish line somewhere up ahead, a version of myself I'd eventually become, and once I got there, the searching would stop, the restlessness would settle. I'd finally arrive at the person I was always meant to be, and everything after that would feel like coasting. I don't believe that anymore. Not because I have given up on becoming someone fuller, more capable, more myself. I still want all of that. But somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting it to end in arrival. What I'm chasing doesn't seem to have a final address. It just keeps opening into more of itself the closer I get. This used to feel discouraging, if I'm honest. Like being told the marathon has no finish line, only more road. But lately, it feels more like relief than disappointment. Because a destination implies a moment where you're finally allowed to stop paying attention, stop growing, stop asking questions. And the more I think about it, the less appealing that actually sounds. We build our lives around milestones, the job, the relationship, the level of success that will supposedly mark the end of striving. And when we reach one, there's a brief satisfaction, sure, but it rarely feels like arrival the way we imagined. Mostly, it feels like standing on a new plateau, noticing there's more landscape beyond it than you expected, and already feeling the pull to keep walking. I used to interpret that pull as a failure to be satisfied, as if wanting more after achieving something meant I was broken, incapable of contentment, chasing an emptiness no accomplishment could fill. Now I think the pull itself might just be what being alive actually feels like, not a malfunction, just the natural shape of a mind that's still curious, still capable of imagining further. So the parallel self I keep circling back to in these reflections isn't a destination either. He's not waiting at the end of the road, arms crossed, finally satisfied. He's further along the same path I'm on, still walking, still discovering new terrain of his own. Catching up to him doesn't mean the walking stops. It just means the view keeps changing. There's something freeing in letting go of the finish line entirely. It means today doesn't need to be justified by some future arrival. The becoming itself is the point, not a means to an eventual rest. Every small revision, every honest feeling actually listened to, every safe choice questioned instead of defaulted to, none of it is preparation for a later life. It is life, happening now in motion. Maybe the map I've been drawing this whole time was never meant to end at a pin marked arrived. Maybe it was only ever meant to keep unfolding, one honest segment revealing the next, for as long as I'm willing to keep looking at what's actually in front of me instead of waiting for a destination that was never really the point. I think about how strange it would actually be to arrive completely, to wake up one day with nothing left to learn about yourself, no more feelings worth listening to, no more small revisions worth making. It sounds less like peace and more like a kind of stillness that would eventually feel like its own quiet tramp. The people I admire most don't seem finished. They seem engaged, still curious about their own lives decades in, still willing to be surprised by themselves. That's a different kind of goal than the one I grew up with. Not to become a fixed, completed version of myself, but to stay someone capable of continuing to change. To keep the muscle of becoming active rather than retiring it once things look good enough on paper. There's no ceremony for that kind of goal, no obvious moment to celebrate. It just asks you to keep showing up, honestly, to whatever today happens to be asking of you. So instead of picturing a map with an ending, I've started picturing one that simply keeps extending past the edge of what I can currently see. Each segment of this reflection has been a little further along that same unfinished map. Not proof that I've arrived anywhere, just evidence that the walking itself has been worth doing. We started this with a parallel universe, a version of a life built from every choice that could have gone differently, living somewhere just out of reach in the imagination. I called it a daydream at first, something to feel wistful about on quiet evenings. But looking back over everything since, I don't think it was ever really about another universe at all. It was about this one, seen more honestly. The other version of myself turned out to be less of a stranger than I expected. He wasn't waiting in some separate timeline, fully finished, judging the gap between us. He was closer than that. A draft I kept revising, a set of instincts my body already understood before my mind caught up with the performance of certainty I'd gotten so good at putting on for other people. Every small choice along the way turned out to matter more than it looked like it did in the moment. The safe option, chosen so automatically I'd barely registered as a decision. The envy I used to silence instead of question. The unglamorous, forgettable actions that never felt significant enough to count as progress, yet somehow were the only thing that ever actually built anything real. What surprises me most arriving here is how little any of it resembled a single transformation. There was no morning I woke up as someone new. There was only a long series of ordinary attentions, listening to a feeling instead of dismissing it, admitting uncertainty instead of performing confidence, choosing the slightly harder true thing over the comfortable familiar one. None of it made a good headline. All of it, apparently, was the actual work. I used to think closing the distance between who I am and who I could be would require some dramatic leap, a single bold decision that would rearrange everything at once. But the distance didn't close that way. It closed the way most real things do, slowly, unevenly, through attention paid consistently instead of courage summoned occasionally. And maybe that's the real shift this whole reflection has led me to. Not the discovery of a better self waiting somewhere ahead, but the realization that he was never separate from me to begin with. He was built, piece by piece, out of every moment I chose to listen instead of override, to try instead of default, to stay honest instead of safe. The parallel universe wasn't a place, it was a practice, and I've been living inside it, unevenly, imperfectly, this whole time. There's no finish line to announce here, no clean moment where the becoming completes itself and rests. Just the next ordinary day, and the next small choice inside it, still capable of closing the distance a little further, the same way every day before it did. If there's one thread running through all of it, I think it's this. Every version of myself I ever admired from a distance turned out to already be available, in fragments, right where I was standing. Not later, not elsewhere, not after some threshold finally got crossed. He showed up in the sentence I chose to say honestly instead of safely, in the restlessness I finally let speak instead of silencing, in the small revision made on an otherwise remarkable Tuesday for no audience, with no guarantee that it would ever add up to anything. I don't know exactly who I'll be a year from now, writing whatever comes after this, but I suspect he'll look back on this moment the same way I've been looking back on the ones before it, not as a dramatic beginning, but as one more quiet page in a draft that never stopped being revised. That feels like enough. Maybe it was always meant to be enough. So maybe the question worth carrying forward isn't whether that other life is real somewhere else. It's simpler than that, and harder too. What's one honest thing today you'd been avoiding, and what would it actually take to stop avoiding it?